Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
Stephanie Kane.
Hey Stephanie, how are you doing today?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Oh, of course. Thank you so much for being on. So, can you tell me about what you've written?
Well, I have written 2 mystery crime series starring strong female detectives. The first was a series of really legal thrillers that starred a dyslexic criminal defense attorney who was actually a better lawyer because of her difficulties reading. And my newest series stars a painting conservator at the Denver Art Museum.
And I just want to say to all my please read all of her books. Right now I'm reading Automat, and it is amazing. I love it so much.
I'm just thrilled that you're enjoying it.
Oh, it's astounding. So you said you write strong female leads in that. What goes into the decision process of making a character to be strong and feminist?
Well, for both of my series characters, they were both inspired by real people. So, for the dyslexic criminal defense lawyer, I was actually inspired by a young relative of mine who has dyslexia, and I watched him grow up and, saw the challenges that he faced. And I thought that, I realized that there were also real gifts, real creative gifts that came with his challenges. So that inspired me to create that character. And my new character, Lily Sparks, the paintings conservator, was actually inspired by another real person named Amy Herman. I don't know if you've heard of her or not, but she's an art historian who teaches FBI agents and cops and lawyers and med students to be more observant by studying paintings in museums. So I read a newspaper article about her, and I thought, gosh, what a cool skill set, for another strong female detective. I guess I'm really attracted to characters who look at the world in ways that are fundamentally different, from the way you and I might. Whether it's, challenges with reading that also bring unique gifts, or being hyper observant to details, which of course also has a downside because it can make you, basically be blind to a larger picture if you focus too much on details. So those were the inspirations for my characters. And I made them women because I'm a female, and I just related to them more that way.
That is so interesting. So what interested you about, art specifically? Was it that article?
No, actually, I haunted museums as a kid. I grew up in New York City, and field trips were we couldn't go to ball games or something like that. So they'd pile us on the subway and we'd go to museums. So museums were always kind of a big part of my life growing up. And my husband and I like paintings, so we go to museums on trips. And so I was always interested in art, but I had zero training in it. I never took an art appreciation course, which I really regret now because I could have used it.
Oh.
But also, the one reason I set my character Lily in that world is because it was a new world for me. And what really motivates me to write is plunging into a new world and learning about that world. So when I read about Amy Herman, and she was in the art world, I thought, that's a world I know zero about. And I guess I just like the challenge. I like the deep dive. I like the steep learning curve, because I always learn just things that blow me away. And that's part of the fun in writing, the research, and then bringing it alive through characters that you invent.
So you mentioned the research part of writing. Could you elaborate on what types of research you do, and do you write outlines?
Well, I research, there's different phases of writing, for me at least, in putting together a book. The first is coming up with an idea, a concept, something that bothers me that I want to explore. And then the second phase is researching, the things around that concept, like what is the museum world like? How do real conservators, look at what their job is, what their work is, stuff like that. Or how does a dyslexic person, how does dyslexia affect their creativity? So the research is really broad, and it's also deep as I get more and more focused into, the contours of the story. Then I start thinking about the characters and their personal arc, how they're going to change, how the events of the story are going to change them, and how they will shape the events. And then I start thinking about the plot. And I used to I'm an outliner. I'm a lawyer, so I've got that sort of analytical kind of left brain thinking. And so I do outline my plots, but I've found that with the Lily Sparks series, I'm a lot more fluid than I was when I first started writing out. So I started with very elaborate chapter outline. And now I find that I do an outline so that I know where I'm going, not that it doesn't change while I'm writing, which is a good thing because it means it's alive. But my outlines are a lot looser now because I think I have more confidence in letting the story come alive as I'm writing it. So it's not like the characters are channeling me and I'm just, writing off the top of my head, but I think it is the research, the immersion in that research that allows the characters and the story to come alive in the way that they do.
That is so interesting. And I also write, and I totally agree with that. Like, I tend to not write outlines, and I've had a lot of people on this show, but whenever I hear about people like you who do write them, it's always so interesting.
Well, it's a way to force me to think about it, to think more deeply about it, because, once you put the words on the page, you as a writer, I'm sure, are familiar with this. You're proud of them. You want them to stay that way. They become kind of frozen. They become your darlings. But if you force yourself to wait a little longer and do a little more thinking and a little more research and a little more what I think of as troubleshooting, coming at the story from all different angles to make sure there's a real story there, or at least enough of a story that you want to dedicate a year of your creative life to trying to bring alive. It's good to force yourself, at least for me, to think about it and research about it a little more before I actually start writing, because once those words hit the page, they don't want to change.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So have you ever had to kill any of your darlings and like any specific?
I have killed whole manuscripts.
Oh, wow.
I killed one of the books that I've written that has really shaped me, the experience of writing it, was a book in the Dyslexic Lawyer series called Extreme Indifference. And the title comes from a degree of murder under Colorado law, where if you are so indifferent to the welfare of your victim, you might as well have intended to kill the person. So the story was about, that's where the title came from, but the story was really about, the everyday indifference with which we treat the people around us, and how that can drive somebody, to do something extreme. That being ignored, that being treated with indifference. And so since it was a legal thriller, I thought, well, how about the indifference of a judge to the effect of what he does in court on the people who are in front of him. So I had a good theme, I had a great story, and, I was under contract for the book to Scribner, so I had a deadline, and, I wrote the manuscript, and I thought it was a pretty good manuscript. And then I actually went into a courtroom. This is how it happened. I'm actually married to a judge. So I thought, okay, I've got this manuscript all done. I'm ready to send it in. And he was going to go and try a case across the state, which meant that, he would be gone overnight for a few days and stuff. And I thought, well, I almost had never seen him actually in court. So I thought, this is I'll just go with him, for a few days and watch his trial and give myself a little break. And so I was sitting in this little courtroom in this, basically a mountain town in Colorado. So it was a very intimate courtroom. My husband was presiding. And I was sitting like right behind the defendant and his lawyer. And it was it was like a contract case. It had to do with unfair competition. The guy had been a salesman, and he had left his employer and gone to a new employer, and he had taken the customer list with him. So the old employer was suing the salesman for theft of his customers, basically. And, the question was, were these customers, contacts of the salesman in such a way that they really were his customers and not, his employer's customers. So anyway, make a long story short, I'm sitting in the courtroom. There was no jury, so it was just my husband was going to be deciding the case. Then he never talks to me about how he's going to decide a case because the buck stops with him. But we go back to the motel at night and, talk about what had happened in the courtroom that day. And the last day of the trial came. And my husband had decided that he was going to rule in favor of the salesman because the customers were really, family members, contacts that the guy had built throughout his entire life. So just before my husband was about to rule, the lawyers jumped up and said, "We have a settlement." Oh. And yeah, exactly. So the settlement was that the salesman agreed not to ever contact those customers again. And basically his lawyer had sold him out. So I was just sitting there and, my husband was surprised, but he couldn't do anything because they had, reached an agreement. And he left the courtroom and I was just sitting there and I saw the salesman turn to his lawyer and say, "So does this mean I can go back to work contacting my customers tomorrow?" He obviously did not understand what he had agreed to. And I watched her explain to him, basically, no, this means you can't, contact these customers again. And I saw his face, and I saw just visibly the effect of what had just happened on him. And I thought, you know what? My manuscript is basically a piece of crap, the one I had written. It does not begin to capture the real effect of what I was trying to talk about. So I went home and I literally tore it up. I started all over again, and I wrote a completely different manuscript. I mean, it still had the theme, and, it still discussed and explored what I wanted to explore, but it was so much better and so much more real. And, that manuscript taught me a big lesson, and that was to not put anything out there that wasn't the best thing that you could do, that was, to the best of your own current abilities, And it just taught me to really respect what I was doing, as a writer, which is to try to get at something that has some kernel of truth in it. whether you explore it through fiction or nonfiction. It has to have, for me at least, it has to have some grounding in something that's real. So that, in a way, I mean, I just learned so much from that manuscript. And, since then I've thrown out other stuff, luckily nothing that's gotten to the point of an entire manuscript. But when I get to that point where it just doesn't ring true to me, or I feel like I'm pushing it in a way that is just for the sake of the story and not for the sake of something deeper, then I know that I'm going down the wrong path and I need to take a step back and think about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it.
I'm just sitting here like I'm in awe. That was such a beautiful story, and that is just so fascinating. Like, thank you. That is an amazing advice, too. I hope everyone listening to this heeds that advice when writing or pretty much doing anything in life.
Exactly. It pretty much in doing anything. You just nailed it.
Yeah. So you talked about how, like, your career as a lawyer and your husband's career as a judge have influenced in that way. Are there any other ways that has influenced your writing?
Well, I think that when I went to law school, I don't know, the way law is taught now has changed quite a bit. But I went to a law school that was very heavy in the old-fashioned Socratic dialogue, which means you're basically, the professor is shooting fish in a barrel. You're called upon. Your questions are thrown at you.
Oh.
And really, it's very humiliating. But what it teaches you very early is that life is a series of pies in the face. And it's all about falling down and picking yourself up. Because the next day you've got to be back in that classroom, and you just learn to that it's not always going to go your way. And what's important is how you recover from it. And that has I was completely unprepared for that when I went into law school. But I think it's one of the best things yet another life lesson that I got out of it. And I think it has served me well as a writer, because there's many heartbreaks and disappointments, probably 10 times as many, as there are, great moments. And you just draw on that realization that, it's all going to be okay, whether it goes your way or not. What's important is that you respond to it. That you get up and fight another day,
Definitely.
So I think in that sense, law helped me as a writer. Also, I was always a very analytical person, which, I guess suited me to law. And I think it suits me to my approach to writing. Do the research, do the work, think about it some more. Come at it from, different angles and see if there's really a story there. And all those are skills that lawyers use day in and day out.
Totally. That is so interesting. So, do you have any tips for writers about how to put, like, such raw emotion into their writing? Because, like, when I was reading your book, it is, like, emotional. Like, it feels very real. Do you have any?
Oh, thank you very much for saying that.
Oh, yeah.
I think one thing that I've done, which I think it's kind of a strength and a weakness of mine as a writer, I tend to compress stuff. So like with dialogue, I'd start out with like a long, sentence after sentence after sentence, and I just cut it back and cut it back and cut it back, so that only the most important words end up in that line of dialogue. And the same thing with, I think, basically any kind of writing that I do, whether it's the exposition part or the action or, the internal dialogue, what the character's thinking, or what the characters are saying. I just try to cut it to the bone. So maybe that's part of what you're reacting to.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think
But I'll tell you, sometimes when I go back and read what I've written, like, to edit it a few weeks later, I think, now what was I trying to say? You can cut so much out that you can, and then you think, oh my God, if I leave it like this, if I don't even know what I was trying to say because I cut so much out, what is a poor reader going to get from it, So you can overdo that,
Do you remember any specific instance to this where you cut way too far and then went, oh no, I need to fix this?
It comes to me all the time because when I'm writing, I'm trying not to edit, not because I don't want to see what I've written, but because the momentum of getting it out, I don't want to slow it down. So, but every time I open my manuscript on the screen, I'm at a random page because I'm trying to get to where I left off. I always see stuff where I think, that is just too telegraphic. That needs one more word, because I just took too much out, Mm-hmm. So it happens all the time. I mean, I can't point to a specific place because all over the place.
Oh, yeah. Yes, I understand that. So, do you have a favorite thing about writing, or more specifically, writing crime and mystery?
Well, I think the reason I am attracted to crime and mystery is because I've always been very curious about people, like walking down the street, if somebody, I just have this natural curiosity about, what's that person about? Or, look at how they're leaning into each other or how far apart these people are walking. Or so there's just it's a sort of a nosiness, and a curiosity about what makes people tick. So like with my villains, I put probably more effort into creating the bad guys than the good guys because the bad guys are the engine of the plot. And they have to start out, at least at the beginning, as stronger than the good guy. Because part of the role of the story is to make the heroine rise to the occasion, rise to a new level of his or her own development. And to do that, you have to have a bad guy that's got a lot of dimension to him or her. So the bad guys really fascinate me. And with them, it's always, why do they do what they do? Why do people do these awful things? And if I can start to actually relate and empathize with the bad guy, I know I've got something really cooking as a writer.
Oh, totally. Do you have any specific things that you keep in mind when writing the bad guy?
Well, the bad guy is just the flip side of the good guy. So whatever makes the bad guy bad has to be both a gift and a challenge. It has to have, some positive thing for him, but the seeds of what makes that tick also are like the seeds of his downfall. So I'll give you an example of that. In A Perfect Eye, which is the first Lily books, Lily Sparks books, the art conservator books, the bad guy is a forger. And, what I found out, what was really fun about writing him was that I learned a lot about forgers. And the thing about the really interesting ones is, art forgers at least, is they don't do it for the money. They're usually a frustrated artist who the art world has refused to recognize. And so they're doing it to prove the experts wrong. So I could really relate to that. because every time you get a book rejected, you think, well, I want to prove this publisher wrong, or every time you get a bad review, I want to prove that person, that critic wrong. So I could get into that, I could relate to that. But the downside to a forger is that, they're getting all this enjoyment out of tricking the art world and proving the experts wrong. But at some point, they want recognition. They want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to be in the shadows, proving the art world wrong. But at some point, they want recognition. And that's the point at which their arrogance kind of overcomes their gaminess, and that's when they get caught. So it's the duality. It's the sort of manic thing that drives them to do these awful things that also becomes their downfall. So that's how I create those are the characters I'm looking for. Ones that have the dimension that leads to their greatness, but also to their downfall. And it's the same thing, frankly, with Lily Sparks. She's got this wonderful talent or skill that she's been trained as a child by her father, to be hyper observant and to pick up details and to remember what she sees and to be able to identify, what's different from what she saw the last time and all that. And those are, wonderful skills that serve her as an art conservator. But at the same time, if you are hyper observant and hyper focused on those details, you could be missing the bigger picture. It could be, your gift could be a blind spot. And indeed it is with Lily.
Oh, yeah.
So she's got sort of like that forger, she's got the upside and the downside. And so the villains, the bad guys, and the heroes, for me, are always just flip sides of each other. And the question is, how far is their talent going to take them? And how far can they fall? Because the flip side of that talent is, something that's, going to be their downfall.
You do something really interesting in Automat, where it puts you, I don't know if you do this in your other books, so let me know, but it puts you in the shoes of the killer. So all the parts about him, or her, I don't know, are done through the eyes of that person. So it's saying you do this. Where did the decision-making process go in putting you in those shoes?
Well, with Automat, I struggled more with the bad guy. I'm not going to tell you if it's a male or a female, but the villain than I usually do, because the bad guy just did such awful things. Mm-hmm. So rather than just throwing him out, I thought he was salvageable, but to make myself get into his frame of mind, I did something that I've never done in a book before, and that is, I've written in other books, even in A Perfect Eye, I've written chapters that are focused on the villain, but I have never written a chapter from the villain's point of view, the first-person point of view of the villain. And I found that I needed to do that to really get into how he felt about what he was doing, because I couldn't get into it otherwise. And unless I could relate to him, really step into his shoes, I couldn't create a character that would be the engine of the plot. So that is the first time I've ever done that. Well, and I'm really glad you found that effective.
Oh yeah, it really worked. And I remember as I was reading it, because it's all in second person. So it's like, oh, you did this. And so I was like, why would I murder someone? And then I went, wait a second. That's not me.
Well, that is the first time I've ever written in second person. Ever.
Oh.
So that's like, that was a total departure for me.
It made it a really fun and interesting read. especially because I've not really read any books in second person because it's such a rare, like, it's
yeah, and
such
I
a
don't,
rare thing.
most of the time I don't like those books. I mean, I've read, but I mean, if it works well, it really does immerse you into both that character's point of view and a present tense, It's like happening right as the character is saying it. So it was a fun experiment, and I'm glad it worked.
Oh yeah, it definitely did. Okay, so kind of a departure from what we've recently been talking about, but when you write, do you have to be in a specific environment?
Well, I used to be able to just plug, like with the dyslexic lawyer stuff, I could just like plug into, sit in my computer and really crank it out. Maybe because I had those such detailed outlines. But now with these new books, I have had to develop this regimen to force myself to pull it out, and it works for me. And what I do is 3 days a week. I swim early in the morning at an outdoor pool that revs up my brain. It gets the blood flowing. I come home at like 7 a.m. I make a big glass of iced coffee with like a ton of oat milk in it because I don't really like the taste of coffee.
Oat milk is the best.
Yeah, it is, And by then I've got so much caffeine and adrenaline charging through me that I get to work and I can get work done, I can't do that every day or I would just completely fry myself, but those days are highly productive days for me. And you know what? Those are the only days I let myself drink coffee. It's sort of like this incentive and reward kind of loop for me,
Mm-hmm.
If I'm gonna have that coffee with oat milk, I better get some work done,
Mm-hmm.
And I don't get up until I've gotten some work done. And
Definitely.
another thing that I discipline myself, I love reading newspapers. I subscribe to like 3 different hard copy print newspapers, partly because I really like doing crossword puzzles. So I don't read the paper until I've done my work. I mean, I just don't, because it would be too distracting. I mean, I could spend the whole day reading the newspaper. So on those days when when I'm scheduled to be totally productive, I rely on that kind of routine, and it's very effective for me.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. So, do you listen to music when you write? And like, if so,
No,
what type?
I cannot have any distraction. I mean, I sit on a porch. We've enclosed our porch because we have a young cat who there's no way to stop him from running into the street. And he just is a fiend for fresh air,
Oh,
so
yes,
the only way to
cat
get him
is
to
behind
calm
me,
down.
and she runs outside all the time. So I'm sorry if you hear any meows on this one. She's going
no.
a little crazy today.
I love the meows. but anyway, we enclose this porch, and that is like, for some reason, it is the perfect combination of stimulus without distraction. I can't, my husband, I told you he's a judge. He listens to music all the time, not when he's on the bench, but, when he's working, when he's writing an opinion, all that. I can't do that. It would just be so intensely engaging and distracting that I wouldn't be able to focus.
Yes.
So,
do you get kind of caught up in the words? That always happens to me. That I spend too much time thinking about what they're saying in the song. And so I write down what they're saying sometimes on accident.
That's really funny.
Has that ever happened to you, though, when you're, like, writing and someone, like, walks in and they're talking and then you start writing down what they're saying because it's on a subconscious?
I've never done that, I have to say. I've never done that, but that would be fascinating.
Yeah, it's a weird quirk that I have, apparently. So, how did you get into writing?
Well, the quick answer is I had a story I wanted to tell. And it's still that way. I can't write unless there's something that I want to explore, which is why that front end of the process is so important for me, coming up with the concept and then troubleshooting it. But the first book that I wrote was called Quiet Time, and it was the only standalone mystery that I've written. And it was loosely based on the murder of my former mother-in-law back in 1973. And what happened at the time was my father-in-law was indicted. This happened like a week or two before I married their son. And so it was like, right before our wedding. And the marriage lasted like 10 years. And there was very little, almost no talk about what had happened. It was kind of a real taboo. The charges against the father were dropped, and, people moved on with their lives, but not really. And so, like 30 years later, I had remarried, and, I told my new husband the story, and he said, well, don't you want to know why those charges were dropped? And I thought, well, yeah, I really would like to know, but I also don't want to plunge back into that very dark time in my life. So anyway, to make a long story short, I did some research and I totally fictionalized it, and that's what got me my first contract with Bantam, Quiet Time. And I was very frank with Bantam that it was based, although it was completely fictionalized, it was based on something that had happened in my life. And the book was published. It had a very short lifespan because it came out I think the week of 9/11. But it had a very interesting second act because about 5 years later, it became a catalyst for reopening that cold case.
Oh.
And my father-in-law, who was then about 80 years old, was re-indicted for murdering his wife. So that became this, there's a very long cold case proceeding, etc. But that book is the only book that I've written that actually went out into the world and had an effect on real-life events. So that book is kind of dear to me, even though it's written in a style that is no longer the way I write. But I've written about that cold case. I've pieced together the original crime and the cold case, and I've looked at them. You might enjoy this as a writer. I've looked at them through a storytelling lens, like having each little slice of it be tied to a narrative technique, like character arcs or point of view, inciting incidents and stuff. And anyway, I wrote it up as a blog, and it's on my website, writerkane.com. It's called Cold Case Story Blog. And it's just, it's a true story. It's not fictionalized. It's now the story that I really wished I could have written when I wrote Quiet Time.
Wow.
So
I think I'm definitely going to read that. I'm sorry that
I think you would really enjoy it.
To around your family, but that sounds like a fascinating story.
Well, it got me into, it's the other thing, I guess, that got me into writing crime and mystery stuff. Because I always wanted to understand what happened. I just wanted to know what happened. And then, of course, I wanted to know why it happened. And all that, when you're involved in a crime, that's basically what you want to know. I interviewed for my blog a cold case victim's advocate who had lost his own son. He'd started this thing called Families of Homicide Victims and Missing Persons. And it's basically an advocacy group for family members of people who have been killed and their cases have never been solved. And I interviewed him for my blog, and he told me, I said, well, what do cold case victims, the families of the victims, well, what are they really looking for? Are they looking for justice? Are they looking for vengeance? What are they looking for? And he told me exactly what I had been looking for. They just want to know what happened. Because unless you know what happened, you really can't move on. I mean, you'd like whoever did it to be brought to justice, but that's not the basic, most important thing that most people, according to him and in my own experience, are looking for. You just want to know what happened.
Wow. Well, you were fantastic to have on. You were a fantastic writer. Thank you so much. I just have one last question.
Well, thanks a million for having me.
Oh, of course. I just have one last question, and that is, what do you have coming up?
Oh, well, the next story has to do with crime scene dioramas that are brought to life. They're enacted by a killer. So it's called Object Lessons, and I'm almost finished with it.
Well, that sounds so cool. I'm going to have to read that. Everybody, go read all of her books. Thank you so much. Do you have any final thoughts before we go to the outro?
No, just that, go to my website. It's writerkane, with a K.com, and you'll see it all.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being on. You are an absolute joy.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, of course. For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
It's Stephanie Kane.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after.
The end.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. This episode is hosted by Molly Southgate. It is edited by Rob Southgate and produced by Southgate Media Group. You can get in touch with the show at readbetweenthelines@gmail.com, or you can send us a voicemail at 708-887-9473. That was 708-887-9473. You can also find us on Instagram at Read Between the Lines Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.